Tonight on Capitol Journal, there's extraordinary growth in the state's revenue, with budgets seeing record surpluses. Senate President Pro Tem Greg Reed joins us to talk about how we got here and what the legislature will do with the money. Alabama in the national spotlight this week as the U.S. Supreme Court hears oral arguments on whether the latest congressional redistricting map complies with the law. I'll sit down with one of the plaintiffs in the case, Evan Milligan, and Tish Faulks from the ACLU to hear their side. And Attorney General Steve Marshall is in studio explaining the state's case in the matter. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. Unprecedented. That's the word being used to describe Alabama's latest revenue report. In the fiscal year 2022 that ended last week, receipts to both the Education Trust Fund and the General Fund were up significantly. Let's take a look at those numbers. The ETF collected $10.4 billion for the year. That's an increase of more than 20% over fiscal year 2021. For the General Fund, which pays for non-education state services, there was an increase of 8.4%, up to $2.7 billion. The extraordinary growth has lawmakers talking about tax cuts, or at least tax rebates, to give part of the surplus back to taxpayers. Others are calling for greater investments in public schools and other underfunded state services. But most all agree that the massive growth will be fleeting as federal dollars dry up and the economic winds shift toward a possible recession. The American Legislative Exchange Council each year ranks states based on economic opportunity and tax structure. The report, called Rich States, Poor States, most recently ranks Alabama 23rd amongst all 50. Jonathan Williams from ALEC was in Birmingham this week and explained how the report helps inform state lawmakers about potential policies working in other states.
For the last 15 years, we've produced the Rich States, Poor States report. And you can find that at richstatespoorstates.org. I put it together with Art Laffer, who is, of course, one of Ronald Reagan's economic advisors, and Steve Moore, economist out of D.C., who advised President Trump. And the reason we put this together was to give state lawmakers, as part of the ALEC mission, resources to figure out how their state compares when it comes to economic growth and opportunity versus the other 49. And so every year around tax day, we come out with our new economic outlook rankings, which are based on things like tax rates and regulation and labor policy, things that we know matter for economic growth, and let's say why jobs continue to leave high tax states like New York and California and Illinois and come to places like Alabama and Texas and Florida, and why people continue to vote with their feet as well and switch state residencies all the time. And Alabama ranks 23rd in economic outlook, and this is obviously middle of the pack, and so there's some interesting takeaways, some very positives out of that. You know, one of the lowest property tax burdens in the country, but then other areas certainly can be improved on. And I think one of the interesting things that we look at in the report as well is from a 15-year perspective, we have this consistent time series to be able to say how states have either improved or not over time. And I think one of the interesting takeaways, and something that I know legislators in Montgomery will be talking about when they come into session, is, you know, how do we keep up with so many of the most competitive states in America that happen to be in the Southeast region?
Multiple Alabama health organizations are urging people to get their flu shots as soon as possible. The Alabama Department of Public Health, the Alabama Hospital Association, the Medical Association of the State of Alabama, and Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Alabama recently launched the No Time for Flu campaign with information about the flu and the vaccine. The vaccine is recommended for people aged 6 months and up, and advocates say getting it early in the flu season is best. Dr. Bernestine Taylor of the Department of Public Health said they are recommending those who are eligible to get both a flu shot and a COVID-19 booster.
Get your flu shot, because this is not a season for flu. And basically the flu vaccine helps to eliminate complications of flu. It decreases hospitalizations and also decreases potential flu deaths as well. Fortunately, we do see a decline in COVID, but it actually is still existing. So the best thing is to arm yourself against both, with both the COVID booster and also your flu vaccine as well.
A few weeks ago, we had a special episode focused on the issue of opioid abuse, particularly on the prevention and treatment of addiction. Tonight, Randy Scott takes a look at the issue from the perspective of law enforcement officers who are on the front lines of this drug war.
You know, you always see about it in other states, you hear about it, it's here, and it's here with a vengeance.
Montgomery County Sheriff Derek Cunningham is talking about the epidemic of illegal drugs, including fentanyl, showing up in his area.
If you look at the number of overdose deaths that we're starting to see right here in our community, I mean, you probably used to see an overdose case probably once every 6 months, but now you're starting to see 2 and 3 a week. That's alarming.
For law enforcement officers, their number one job is fighting crime. But in today's society, that fight has increased to include the fight against opioid use. Items such as fentanyl have flooded areas around the state. So now law enforcement officers find themselves protecting the people they serve and also trying to find ways to protect themselves.
Part of the tools those law enforcement officers have to fight those deadly drugs includes a new antidote called Narcan.
All of our deputies carry Narcan. All of our deputies are trained on what to look for if you have an opioid situation where a person is overdosing. This black box contains our Narcan, and it's a 2-pack dose of Narcan. It's a nasal spray, and all of our deputies carry it in their cars. They all have been trained on it.
The sheriff says another weapon is education.
And that's why it's very important for me as being a sheriff, being an administrator for this agency, to educate my people. And not only my people, I thank the members of the media for educating the community about what we're facing out here on the streets on a daily basis.
For Capitol Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
October is typically Alabama's driest month. So far, this October is definitely following that trend, as the state has seen precious little rain. The situation has the Alabama Forestry Commission raising awareness about the potential for forest fires. Capitol Journal's Karen Goldsmith has that story.
For the past few weeks, the weather around the state has been incredibly beautiful, but it's also quite dry.
We have not had rain in over 2 weeks. There's no rain in the forecast for another 10 days.
Because it's very dry, the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, has placed 12 Alabama counties under an outdoor burn ban. Balcy Butler with Alabama's Forestry Commission explains what that means.
Well, that does not include grilling. Grilling is safe because it's off of the ground. When we talk about outdoor burning, we're talking about burning organic material like leaves, old branches from blown over or cut down tree limbs, things of that nature. Things that people would do. Some people would burn the land off. It's great for the habitat.
And ADM says trash burning is never allowed. And since it's very dry, forestry would like for all Alabamians to not burn and to halt and be more aware of certain everyday behaviors.
When you ride down the road, somebody right now could throw out a cigarette and that ignites a fire. Somebody's pulling a trailer and the chain is dragging and you see the sparks popping. That could start a fire.
Currently, Alabama is trending ahead in the number of fires per acre compared to 2016 when a record was set.
In 2016, in the 3 months, we had a 3-month, from October 1st through December, we fought over 34,000 acres in fires. Right now, for the entire year, we're at about 32,000 acres, and that number's only going to increase. If we don't get any rain, we'll start seeing an increase in fires, and that number's just going to grow tremendously, really, really fast.
He breaks it down even further.
The week that ended in September the 26th, we had like 38 fires for 254 acres. When we hit from 9/26 until 10/3, October the 3rd, we had 109 fires that consumed 1,468 acres.
Butler recommends waiting to burn until November or December after significant rainfall.
The biggest thing is just be patient. Right now is not the time to burn. We are experiencing higher winds, and those higher winds can push those fires and faster than you can catch it.
For Capitol Journal, I'm Karen Goldsmith.
To report any wildfires or to request a burn permit, call 1-800-392-5679. The state is seeking to set a new execution date for an inmate who had his lethal injection called off last month after multiple failed attempts to connect a vein. Attorney General Steve Marshall's office this week asked the Alabama Supreme Court to set a new execution date for Alan Eugene Miller. Miller was sentenced to death after being convicted of killing Terry Jarvis, Lee Holdbrooks, Scott Yancey in a 1999 workplace rampage. And the state has set an execution date for Kenneth Eugene Smith, who was convicted of killing Elizabeth Sennett in a murder-for-hire scheme. That execution date is set for November 17th. And again, it comes after the state has come under intense criticism for the way lethal injections have been carried out in recent months. We'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capitol Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capitol Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capitol Journal podcasts.
Next, I'm joined by Senate President Pro Tem Greg Reed. Senator, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
You're welcome, Todd. Always good to be with you, friend.
Well, I'm glad to have you on this week because I have to ask you about this budget situation. Mary Sell reported earlier this week, in light of the end of the fiscal year, that the Education Trust Fund collected about $10.4 billion this past fiscal year. That's unheard of, a 20% increase. You also have an 8% increase in the general fund, again, kind of unheard of. Unprecedented growth. So my question is, what happens when we see surpluses of this magnitude? Where does that surplus go?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is congratulations to the people of Alabama. I mean, I talked with legislators in other places around the country, and Alabama's economy post-COVID has been robust, to say the least. So congratulations to the people of our state for having such an attitude toward growth, an attitude toward growing their businesses, being able to be, conservative as we are in the legislature, trying to maintain the amount of resource that we spend, the things that get you to a place to where you have a huge carryover. So that's the first thing to be said. Number two is if you wind up with these kinds of resources, you have to recognize this is a one-time thing. It's not going to be like this forever. We're already experiencing what we see at the national level and even in our own state. Inflation, that's a real challenge, an economic opportunity that may be facing recession in the future. So as you look at these resources being extraordinarily high, you have to think about, do we need to give these resources, some of these resources, back to the people of Alabama? That's a topic that will be discussed in the coming legislative session, I'm confident, and I think it rightfully should be. Mm-hmm. What are we going to be doing in making investments when you have these kinds of resources, just as we've done with Arpa funds from the federal government? You want to make wise choices, wise investments that are things that are going to be around for years and years into the future, not just spend these resources like water through our fingers. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that we use them for very important topics. You're going to have a lot in the legislature looking for those topics. I've met with the governor this week. Her team's looking for ways to use these resources on things that are very important to the people of our state. As we get into the budget process, trying to allocate those appropriately is going to be the job of the legislature. And then looking at resources going back to the people of Alabama is a topic that we'll all be talking about.
Mm-hmm. There has been talk of rebates, things like that, kind of one time, again, getting to the point of it's one-time money maybe and not setting up something into the future. Switching gears real quick, I wanted to ask you about broadband. This has really been the topic of the last couple of months, especially since y'all passed the Arpa2 investments, I guess back in January. You're starting to see that really, that rubber hit the road, if you will. So I know you were at the recent broadband announcement from Governor Ivey. I heard Finance Director Bill Poole say that this state may spend as much as $2 billion, most of that federal money, of course, expanding this high-speed internet into rural areas, maybe over the next 5 or 6 years. Can you talk about the importance of doing that, why this has been such a focus for the state?
Well, if you think about internet and the importance of it, it impacts and affects every part of our life, whether it's our business, whether it's just quality of life, ordering things online, we all do that. Looking at the health care for certainly people in rural areas or senior citizens that can communicate with their physician, via the internet. And then looking at education. I mean, this was something proven to us through the COVID era, to where kids are at home, they're having to learn, having access to the internet is so important. So is it a big deal? Absolutely. Does it affect every area of our life? It does. So is it good for the people of Alabama that we spend resources, state and federal, on this topic? And I think the answer is yes. Now, if you look at the number to put internet in front of every home in the state of Alabama, that's billions of dollars of investment in infrastructure. But we need to get going on that. We need to get working on that as best we can. And so the attitude with those Arpa funds was to set aside hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to move in the direction of helping grow access for unserved and underserved areas that do not have opportunity for internet service in their communities. We spent $83 million of those resources on what the governor announced that you were making reference to as middle mile. Basically, you've got the internet interstate highway that's coming through Alabama where all the information is available. How are you going to divide that up to where it reaches rural communities in particular? And the middle mile investment is going to help that happen. And so as we continue to look at the thing that everybody really cares about, which is when's it going to be at my house, okay? You've got to have the middle mile to be able to make that happen. So the announcement is going to be $83 million spent over a 3-year window to be able to finish that infrastructure that allows then there to be a pull-off from that middle mile section to go to last mile, which is it go into people's homes. So it's a very important investment for the state.
The election is about a month away, so we're really getting into the thick of it. You've got senators up for re-election, lots of changes maybe in the legislature, but do you see any potential really close races between Republicans and Democrats? A lot of that these days is kind of adjudicated in the primary, right? Or do you see the Senate remaining about the same in terms of the balance of power?
I would say we're going to be about the same as far as the balance of power. We've had some very aggressive races in the primary. We've got some other senators that are running aggressive races in the general election. We've been focused on trying to help and support members in the legislature as best we can. That's something that Leader Schofield and I have been focused on and trying to work on. But I think the balance of power is going to be very similar to what we've seen. Currently, we've got 27 Republicans, 8 Democrats. I think that will probably be pretty much the same as far as the balance of Republican versus Democrats in the body. We've been able to have great relationships with both parties. I have as pro tem, being able to work with everybody, making sure everyone's voice is heard, and that we wind up with a much better product for the people of Alabama when we allow everybody to have their input. And so that's been a hallmark of what I've tried to do as president of the body, and that will continue to be my focus as we move into a new quadrennium.
Well, speaking of that, after the election comes again time to govern. The regular session is some time away, so this may be a little bit premature, but I'm sure that you're talking about the agenda for the next year. You mentioned meeting with the governor. For the Senate in particular, and for you, what are some of the things on the top of your agenda looking toward next session?
Well, one of the things that we're going to need to deal with early in the process, maybe in the next legislative session, is the Arpa2 funds. The opportunity to deal with those now that we have those resources. It's going to be a different process than what it was with Arpa1. These are again rescue funds that came from the federal government as a result of coronavirus. The ruling from the Department of the Treasury is going to be different in how we can use those monies, but Alabama has $1.1 billion that is available to the people of Alabama under these certain criteria. So we're going to need to deal with that. That will be a big priority for the legislature. Looking at budgets, you mentioned earlier, we've got carry forward resources in both budgets. So how do we deal with that? How do we manage those budgets? If you've got more resources, what do you use them on? You know, the topic of rebates and the idea of giving money back to the people of Alabama is a topic that will be discussed. So that's going to be a big priority. Looking at incentives, one of the things that we're going to have to deal with in the coming session is going to be the renewal of Alabama's Jobs Act. And the Jobs Act has been incredibly successful. We've been able to use that to recruit industry, manufacturers, big businesses to Alabama to provide jobs for our citizenry. And so those incentive packages are very important. They will be required renewal in the upcoming legislative session. Also, there are issues related to education. Education is always a very important topic. We've done some significant things. You mentioned I've talked with the governor, and I have met with the governor. She's got a couple of ideas we'll learn more about related to education themes that are important to her and her administration. So those are going to be big topics that we'll be dealing with as we come back in March of 23 to be back in legislative session.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned incentives. We've covered that a little bit here. You know, there was a committee meeting about it. I had Director Canfield or Secretary Canfield on here looking at changes to those, right? Not just a renewal, but an update, considering it's been, 3 or 4 years since they've been updated. Talk about the importance of the legislature's oversight role, of incentives and how those incentives are used and putting restraints and things like that on the department.
Well, we changed Alabama's incentive program. I've carried those legislative items, the Alabama Jobs Act, Growing Alabama, the AIM Act, which was all put together as one legislative item that was renewed as the Alabama Jobs Act. It was going to run for about 2.5 years. That time will be up by summer of 23, so we'll have to deal with this in the regular session coming up in March of 23. The reason that we did that is because the environment is so competitive. We didn't want to lock ourselves into something that was a long-term statutory requirement for Alabama when our friends over in South Carolina or Mississippi or Louisiana are doing different things trying to attract. Mm-hmm. The thing that we changed about the Jobs Act early on, this was now 5 years ago as we worked on that, is to make it as a pay-as-you-go kind of a system so that we didn't borrow money and pay manufacturers to come to Alabama, for instance, which is the way that we did it in years past. We basically incentivize them to come, and then once they do the things that we require them to do contractually, then we rebate them, give them resources back in tax credits. And that program has worked extremely well. Alabama's had great success with it. You know, I was looking at a couple of statistics here. If you look at gross revenues, Job Act incentives, and total revenues for the state, we've had about 162% growth in those areas as a result of the incentive packages. Also, we had a goal of a 7% increase on average pay, which was at about $17 an hour. That's now an increase, I think it's 31%, up to $23 an hour is the average. So the incentives have paid off. They've attracted folks to come from other places across the globe to Alabama, provide jobs for our citizens, and be able to increase quality of life for our citizenry by allowing them to make more money on the new jobs that are coming to our communities. So that's the goal of the incentives. Now, having transparency, oversight from the legislature, making sure we're incentivizing the right things, that we're using the resources in a way that the legislature sees and understands that we're getting a great return on the money that we're putting forward as an incentive is something very important. I think as Secretary Canfield, other members of legislative leadership continue to look at the incentives, I think we need to have a close eye on transparency, making sure that everybody understands we're incentivizing the right things to keep it going, to keep the growth going. I also think that we would probably be looking at a shorter time frame as we did this past renewal. 2.5 years, there's a lot can happen in that window. We may be headed for a different economy in the next 2.5 years, as we've seen at the federal level. We need to be agile. We need to be able to move. We need to be able to do things differently if it's required, so that we can continue the growth that Alabama has so much enjoyed.
Mm-hmm. Certainly an issue we're going to be following. We're out of time, but I really want to thank you for coming on Capitol Journal.
Thank you, Todd. Good to be with you, buddy.
We'll be right back.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Alabama is again in the national spotlight this week as the U.S. Supreme Court heard the Milligan versus Merrill redistricting case. Joining me now is Evan Milligan, the plaintiff in that lawsuit, and Tish Faulks from the ACLU of Alabama. Thank you for coming on Capitol Journal.
Thank you for having us.
Y'all were both at the Supreme Court. Obviously, Evan, you're the plaintiff in the case. That had to be a fascinating experience. Let me just ask you the basics. What's the impetus? Where did this lawsuit originate? What are the basic points? And what are you asking the court to do?
Sure. So there's there's 3 other individual plaintiffs, and then 2 plaintiffs that are groups, Greater Birmingham Ministries and NAACP Alabama. And most of last year, we were a part of a statewide coalition of advocates who are really working to inform and educate our neighbors about the importance of redistricting, to tie the release of census data to redistricting. So we pushed out sub-grants to groups on the ground. We did different trainings. And when that census data was released, we were also involved with helping the general public understand the notes and comments period that the legislature would be engaging at the beginning of September, to take in feedback from the public as far as how they wanted their maps to look. Now that was an interesting period because we didn't have a draft of the map to respond to as members of the public. We hadn't seen what the state of Alabama was actually considering at that point, but still went out and did our due diligence as far as encouraging the members and the constituents that we serve to become involved. And once Governor Ivey called us for the special session, we, like many other Alabamians, got our first chance to look at the map when Representative England leaked a version of the map that had emerged in the committee, a version of the congressional map, leaked it via Twitter for folks to look at it. So that let us know what we were walking into. We did our best to get statements on the record during that special session, and also submit draft maps that we felt like did a better job of honoring the voting rights of Black Alabamians. The state, unfortunately, wasn't swayed by what we had to present. So once the congressional map had been voted through the State House, the State Senate, and signed into law by the governor, then we filed the lawsuit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Tish, walk me through some of the legal arguments that were made before the court.
Absolutely. We actually put forth both claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. At the beginning of the year, when we had our hearing before the court, the 3-judge panel, we presented both, but it's a matter of judicial construction that they go for the statutory and interpret under that first. So this 3-judge panel looked at all of the information we provided during the hearing at the beginning of the year, and they concluded that as we put forward in the piece of litigation, the data indicated that the state of Alabama had not done its due diligence in evaluating the impact of the maps that they had drawn on the Black community. Remember that Section 2 of the VRA does not focus on the intent of the legislature, and we never claimed that this was an intentional wrongful act. But what our experts and our analysis did show was that there was a significant concern with the packing of voters into District 7 and the cracking both of Jefferson County and of Montgomery County. And we concluded, looking at all of that analysis, that it was important at this point that we stepped in with the piece of litigation.
Hearing from those that drew the maps, right, the legislature, the committee, and everything, what they say is that they were just following the rules, right? That trying to redraw the maps based on population changes and to make it race neutral. They use that term a lot, race neutral when it comes to redrawing the maps. And they claim if you did it that way, if you did it the alternative way, you would have to use race, therefore violating the Constitution. What do you say to that argument?
Well, one of the elements that the redistricting committee builds into their guidance is respecting the core of prior voting districts. And if you do that year over year, what you basically are doing is baking in the historical discrimination that has occurred previously. We know, of course, that the only reason that Alabama has District 7 is because Section 2 of the VRA compelled that district be created. And while the state of Alabama continually says that they behaved in a race-neutral manner, that is not what is called for the state of Alabama, a place with a history of failing to provide opportunities for black voters to elect candidates of choice. In fact, what the law requires is more holistic than that. Section 2 of the VRA calls on the state to evaluate whether their historic behavior in drafting maps is having the result of impairing black voters from electing their candidates of choice. And all of the data shows that that is in fact what happened here.
Yeah, going back to the creation of the 7th District, what is now the 7th District, it was after the Jingles ruling, correct? And so I hear frustration from lawmakers saying, yeah, well, we're essentially keeping that district, which was created, affirmatively and intentionally to make sure there was representation for African Americans. And so they're frustrated now, saying, well, I thought we were just doing the right thing and playing by the rules. So does the court need to offer a new doctrine in this, in terms of what rules to follow? Should race neutral versus involving race in the drawing of districts? Do states, not just Alabama but everywhere, need better guidance on how to do this right?
Well, there are actually very few jurisdictions compelled to alter their usual course of dealing by Section 2. Section 2 claims are very rare, and there is a particular history that comes into considering whether or not race is now something that we can just ignore. One of the things that Evan and I have always talked about in our discussions is this idea that people think that racism no longer exists because we, Evan and I, are allowed to eat at the lunch counter. But the question is, are we allowed to purchase a restaurant on Main Street? Are we allowed to be the people who make the decisions about whether or not this is going to be an ongoing business? And in Alabama, there is the facade that racism no longer exists. But it is still true that in the state of Alabama in 2022, we have not elected a black candidate to a statewide office. And that can't be happenstance. And considering how conservative the black community is in Alabama, it's not just about conservatism either.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've seen the alternative maps, or at least some mock-ups of them, and they're really interesting. But if we did go, ultimately everything boils down to politics, right? You can't escape the politics of it. So Evan, let me ask you, if we went to two districts that were maybe not necessarily majority, but close, significant African American population, you still might have competitive races. You could see a situation where maybe down the line Republicans are competitive and may win those seats.
Right.
So is there a worry or a concern that that could backfire over time, and go from one Democrat representing in Alabama's congressional delegation to zero?
Well, at the lower court, at the district court in Birmingham, the court actually ordered the state to redraft a map that featured two opportunity districts, or the closest thing to it. Opportunity districts being districts where you have majority or near majority voting age black population that can elect a candidate of their choice. So what you're saying is, yeah, as population shifts happen, certainly there's always the way that numbers can influence election outcomes. But I think in this case, our case was pretty simple. We demonstrated there's a test that has to be established to conduct a type of analysis under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. There's certain things you have to show that were clearly shown. That's why the lower court's decision, it had 3 judges, 2 of whom were appointed by President Trump. They wrote over 200 pages of opinion saying, had we taken this case to trial, it would be overwhelmingly likely that we would prevail under our claim. So to me, resolving that claim as the law stands now is what's important. And as based on our numbers right now in the state, numbers of black Alabamians living in the Black Belt and in Mobile, it actually justifies the creation of a second congressional district.
Because it's make sure my numbers are correct. 27%
right.
African American population.
That's right.
But with only one congressional district, that's I guess 14 roughly.
14%.
Yeah. So with 2, it would be 28, which is pretty close to that.
Right.
Was that demonstrated in the argument?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. And then also, the state wasn't locked into creating one map. There are many ways that they could have heeded the court's order, and they would have been able to bring back a number of maps to the court for them to review within the allotted time frame. They chose not to do this. So whether or not they came back with a map that had our current 7th district and then an additional district that maybe had 51%, 47%, 48% African American, or something that would have been higher, slightly lower. They had options. Those weren't explored, so we would be playing a hypothetical game, and if we prevail, if the substance of the lower court's ruling prevails, we'll be back at the lower court actually doing what they asked for the first time, which would have saved taxpayers a lot of money. There are many things that we can do here in Alabama, in addition to being making decisions that really reek of racial bias and then opposing those decisions. We can do that. We can do that with the best of them. We can be oppressive. We can be advocates with the best of them. But there's so many other things that we can do here. We have science and natural world things. We have children that are hungry to learn that can't learn in some of the schools. We have all kinds of opportunities to be giving people the desire to grow as leaders here and not do things that would run them away and influence them to raise their families in other parts of the country. And I think the people that are sort of coming of age now have a very different understanding of what it means to be an Alabamian, that we can be proud of our culture and our heritage here and also proud of democracy. And that's what we're trying to demonstrate.
Well, y'all were in the room at the Supreme Court, the 9 justices asking questions and things like that. I won't ask you to predict an outcome, but what was your reading of their, did they tip their hand at all as to how they might rule on this case? Did you get any kind of indication?
I think that looking at the court, it's clear that there is a dividing line asking the question, do we still need to center a discussion about racial makeup, or have we evolved to a place where that is no longer relevant? And I think that what you see is that if you follow the state's argument that we need race neutrality, you are always going to end up with something that has the impact of impairing the opportunity for Black voters to select candidates of choice. The United States is a country that is riddled by racism in its history, and we have never held anyone to account for that fact. And therefore, race keeps showing up and playing a role over and over again in all of our institutions, in all of our systems. Section 2 of the VRA recognized that that was a continuing concern. It tried to focus state legislatures to examine, to evaluate, to study. And what Alabama failed to do here is that it failed to be introspective about how its line decisions would impact a particular part of the state's population that has historically been disenfranchised. And we are not ready to move from that problem yet.
Well, it's a monumental case. It's going to have far-reaching consequences, and we're out of time, but I really appreciate y'all coming on the show, having come back from D.C. and been at the Supreme Court. Thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Thank you for having us.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Next, I'm joined by Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. General, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Always good to be with you. Thank you.
You've had a busy couple of weeks here. I wanted to start off with talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, the redistricting case. You were up there, in the oral arguments. It was a big national, deal. But this is, of course, just to explain a little bit, a lower court, the 11th Circuit, a panel there, ordered the legislature to redraw the congressional map to include 2 districts where African Americans make up a significant, maybe not a majority, but a significant percentage of the population. The state appealed that ruling. The Supreme Court stayed it in order to hear arguments, which happened last week. This week. Walk me through the state's case in this lawsuit.
Yeah, let me, and only just to be technically correct, it wasn't the 11th Circuit that ruled. It was actually a 3-judge panel that included one 11th Circuit judge, but was also 2 district judges. They're the ones that heard the testimony from multiple plaintiffs groups, because there are more than one case that's pending, making these allegations under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. One thing I think it's important to remember is what's the history of this map. And if you look back, this map had its origin as a result of litigation back in the early 1990s. And as a result of the work of a federal judge, drew the maps that we now have had in place for a little bit over 40 years. These are maps that have been proposed by a democratically controlled House and Senate in Alabama in 2000, was pre-cleared and approved during the Obama administration. Eric Holder, being the Attorney General, his Civil Rights Division, blessed the map. Map didn't really change much in 2010. We litigated it multiple occasions in 2010. Each of those occasions, the map was found to be valid. And in fact, Todd, if you took the 2010 map and laid it over the 2020 map, there's very few changes at all. In fact, small population changes we've seen in North and South Alabama. But beyond that, it's that same map that we've had historically since the 90s. And yet, the 3-judge panel suddenly found that that's in violation of Section 2. And our position has truly been, the legislature, through the committee that was assigned this responsibility, and that was Representatives Pringle and Senator McClendon, who I think did an outstanding job, used traditional redistricting principles in being able to adopt this very much historic map. They looked at incumbencies and where they were. They looked at communities of interest that would are recognized and have been recognized historically in Alabama. They looked at this issue of compactness, because you don't want a district that goes from all the way north to all the way south. You want there to be some compactness to it, and use that criteria in ultimately drawing the map that the legislature adopted. And what we've seen through the arguments of the court is really a very central question, and that is, under the 14th and 15th Amendment, is a state allowed to use race as a criteria in drawing the maps? We say no. In fact, we sort of, the argument is, if we had used race as a factor in drawing the maps, we would have been subject to litigation and been argued that we violated the law. And so, to the extent that we saw as part of the testimony at trial, that one of the experts for the plaintiffs said they tried 2 million different runs through an algorithm to draw 2 majority-minority districts where race was not a factor, and they couldn't do it. And so, our argument to the court is, if you're asking us to use race as a criteria, then you are compelling us to be able to violate the Constitution in the work that we've done. We think the arguments went well. Really proud of Eddie LaCour, our Solicitor General, and his team, and the preparation for that and his argument before the body. But very much feel confident coming out of there that the court understood our position, and we look forward to seeing the result.
You mentioned the 14th Amendment and how, that a lot of arguments seem to be about that, how it could be kind of in conflict with Section 2, and I think the words were said, maybe they're at war with each other in some context. And Justice Jackson addressed that, and she kind of argued a point herself.
And by the way, I like what you said. She argued the point. It was not a question.
It was not a question, and so a little different style there than maybe traditional court justices. But she argued about the 14th Amendment, saying it itself is not race blind, saying that it was passed after the abolition of slavery with that context of race baked in. Her point being that the Constitution does allow states to consider race so long as it does so in a way that is to prevent discrimination. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this was not even a point that was briefed by the parties. This was something that was singularly raised by Justice Jackson. By the way, none of the other justices weighed in on. But the reality is that we disagree strongly with what many have described as progressive originalism that she was attempting to offer. And to me, as somebody that's an observer of the court, this seemed to be setting the stage for cases that are coming later in the term, dealing with college admissions and how much race can be a factor in that. But we disagree strongly with her, not only her statement, and it truly was a statement from the bench, but also whether or not that's the applicable interpretation of the 14th Amendment.
It was interesting to hear Eddie LaCour essentially ask the court for guidance. It seemed like he was saying, look, we want to do this right. We think we're doing this right. But there are conflicting rulings, statutes, amendments. Does the court, and not just for Alabama, but for all states, need to set a new doctrine or clarify a new doctrine once and for all so that these questions don't have to be adjudicated every time we redraw a map?
Yeah, I think what Eddie was saying is really that voice of the judges who are required to consider these cases is that there is a lack of clarity, particularly involving a situation that was presented in the court here where you have a multi-district map that involves the House of Representatives for Congress. Is what is the ultimate criteria, and you may have heard this term jingles thrown out there. It's a historic case.
Gingles,
yes,
depending on your Alito's, that's how he pronounced it.
And I think particularly the first factor is the one that courts have struggled with the most. It ultimately, and you heard, it was kind of interesting, it kind of went the other way, where Justice Kavanaugh, to every one of the advocates, said, I'm struggling with this idea of compactness. Tell me how you define it and how it is this court's supposed to handle it. And so when you have the court seeking clarity from the advocates and the state of Alabama clearly reaching out saying, we think you need to provide more clarity, in and of itself it shows the difficulty in the application of these statutes and the difficulty for state policymakers to be able to comply with the law. And so I think what you're going to see from this, and remember, it's not just Alabama that this matters to. There are multiple other states, including the state of Louisiana, who had their case stayed pending the decision in ours as well, is that you really, I think, are going to see this court try to give some additional guidance at the lower courts about what it is that they are evaluating factually and what they are legally applying to those facts to determine whether or not plaintiffs can meet those burdens. Because one of the things that you also may have listened to is Justice Alito said that if plaintiffs ultimately meet the first factor under that test, then basically it's a slam dunk for the rest of it. So clearly the first factor of Jingles was something that was talked about a lot during the argument. We think that unlike the plaintiffs, that we've given the court some benchmarks to consider, particularly this idea of how would an unbiased map drawer be able to draw those maps using the traditional criteria that have been used in redistricting. We think that there'll be clarity from this case, and again, I think it will support and strengthen Alabama's arguments here.
We'll certainly be following that. I wanted to, while you're here, I have to ask about gambling. We had this pretty monumental ruling come out of the state Supreme Court talking about casinos in Lowndes County and Macon County. You celebrated this as a huge win at the court. Can you explain legally maybe how we got here over the last 5 years and what this ruling actually means?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm glad you pointed out 5 years, because it has been a long slog, and not because we've had delays at the Supreme Court. Frankly, we've had difficulty getting our cases heard at the local level. This was initiated a little differently than what we've seen historically, because the Supreme Court's been abundantly clear: electronic bingo is illegal. However you characterize it, whatever you want to do, that these are truly slot machines, and that's contrary to Alabama law and is not something that somebody can lawfully use in their business. But yet the efforts of the past have really centered on the criminal side of these cases: seizure of machines, forfeiture of funds, some extent criminal prosecutions, although remember they're only misdemeanors. And we went a little different approach, because although those were successful for short periods, they didn't sustain in closing down what were unlawful businesses. We've used a vehicle that is given to the Attorney General, and that's to seek the stoppage of public nuisances. Alabama law was clear before that gambling is a nuisance per se, which means that it just simply, all we had to prove is there were illegal gambling operations, and that's enough. And what the Supreme Court said last Friday, with a great deal of frustration, by the way, I don't think I've ever seen the language that we saw in that court being abundantly clear.
Justice Shaw's opinion was very...
And I get it, because I will tell you, I share that same frustration, because I'm simply doing the job that the state of Alabama requires me to do, and that's to enforce the law. And here the court has said very clearly to the operation at Victoryland, to the operation at Lowndes County, that you're in violation of the law, and directed the trial court to enter an order consistent with what this court has said, is that they must shut down. But there's broader application than simply those two facilities. That happened to be procedurally the only two cases that were there. But also, we have the action that's pending involving Green Track, and it's simply not in the same posture with the court yet because of some actions of the trial judge there. But the same law applies. The same decision the court rendered in the case last Friday should apply to Green Track as well. But it also should send a message to those facilities that are in Jefferson County, which we also believe are in violation of the law. We have given the opportunity for local officials to do their jobs, whether it be the local prosecutor, who has the opportunity to file a public nuisance action as well, local law enforcement who can make those notifications, that unless and until the legislature comes in and changes the law in the state of Alabama, it is clear that electronic bingo is unlawful. And very pleased with what the court did last week.
The question I, and probably everybody have, is, as you mentioned, there have been actions in the past, raids, they changed the machines, they reopened. And so will this actually lead to casinos shutting down, and how does that work? Is it a law enforcement thing? How does it physically happen? And will it happen? Should people expect for Victoryland to close?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's part of the reason why we chose the strategy we did, is that the court is directing the trial judge to enter the injunction that we've asked for, the preliminary injunction, which means that is a court order directing the party that was sued, and there's multiple entities that are listed that operate these facilities, to cease your operation. And in the event they don't, we don't have to rely upon local law enforcement to act.
That's kind of the trouble, right? They're all very supportive of. Yeah.
We can petition the judge directly to then hold those entities in contempt, where with a criminal penalty that really doesn't scare anybody about going to jail, which has been an effort to be able to change that over the years in Alabama and never worked. Here is one that the teeth of a contempt action can jail somebody for not complying with the law. And so we feel very good about where we're postured. We hope that people that are defendants in this case that are making those decisions understand that they have to follow the law. And maybe while they had this argument that they wanted to present that somehow know they were operating lawfully, now it's clear that they aren't. And there's no justification for them to continue moving forward. And so my hope is that once we are able to receive that final order from the Supreme Court, that the local judge who has the case, whether it be the one involving Victorland or those in Lowndes County, will operate quickly and that the orders will be in place to be able to shut them down.
As I said, very busy time for your office.
It is.
Thanks for your time coming on Capitol Journal.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capitol Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capitol Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capitol Journal podcasts.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next Friday night at 7:30 right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.